I'm Miss V with the Wichita Falls Art Council, and today we're going over Lesson 19, Presidential Patterns. For this lesson, you'll need the portrait template of George Washington, a pencil, a black marker and/or a Sharpie, along with some optional coloring tools like colored pencils. This lesson is similar to something known as Zentangling or Zendoodling, which is basically the process of either on a canvas or a template of sorts, you cut apart pieces of whatever you are trying to create, and you add a bunch of repeating patterns on it in order to make it flow. For this lesson, it's going to be a little more structured, but it's along the same guidelines or the same essence. So right here, I have an example of how I did my steps for this piece. So I started off with the template, then using the portrait that I'm going to be showing later, I have a little bit of a base for his pose. I cut apart the pieces of the pose into little sections where I want to have different patterns, and by the end of it, I have a light outline on the background along with all of the patterns on his body. Now there's a few different ways to do this. One way is if you would like to have some simpler patterns and then having a more complex background, such as this example with a portrait of Vincent van Gogh. Or, if you'd like, you can ignore a bit of the background, or you don't really have to have much of a background, such as this example here, as long as you focus on having some very detailed pattern work. So right here, we have the example of the portrait that we are going to be using. And on the right side, I have my tablet being shown, and I'm going to quick draw out how George Washington's base body is, along with giving some suggestions if there's any confusion on where to start off with this. So for me, I like to start off with the right bent arm. So what I do is I hold a little area right here onto the shoulder. I draw a line down to the wrist. I try to find the middle portion of the line that I drew, and from there, I draw myself a small triangle. And that's going to be my base for how I draw out the arm. Now from there, I'm going to copy a little bit of how the arm looks on the piece. And then I'm going to clean up any extra lines that I may have from this. I'm going to fix that up a little bit. And there's the base for your arm. So for the rest of the piece for George Washington, I like to try and find any other shapes that may help guide me towards the opposite side or wherever else I'm going to be going in the piece. So in this case, I see a little space in between where the body is, the torso, and the bent arm that kind of looks rectangular in nature. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that out. And then from there, I'm going to find myself some reference points. So I'm going to have my reference point right here for where his button is for his vest or his coat, alongside a reference point right here for where his sword is. So I'm going to start looking to see what other shapes there are, and I'm noticing that there's a lot of triangular shapes. So from here, for example, I'll get my main reference points and I'll put those together with this line. Here, I'm seeing a lot of triangles. So I'm going to be separating this part into a shorter triangle and a longer triangle. I'm going to bring down a reference line to help guide me when I'm drawing out the rest of the vest. And remember, this doesn't have to be perfect. As long as you get the general shape and everything, you should be good to go. For this area, I have a little bit of the vest, and there's a couple of different triangular shapes here. So I'm going to draw out my triangle shapes, using my reference line as a bit of a guide. And from here, for the rest of the body, I'll draw out my reference line, putting it down just a little bit longer, right here. And then I'll go ahead and see where his rest of his leg is, which is right in this area. I'm gonna have a slightly angled line right here for his leg. And then it'll be pretty much the same for his other leg. That's going a little bit more backwards or stepping behind him. And I see that there's a bit of a coat tail. So once I finish cleaning up this other leg, I'm gonna go ahead and just draw this line downwards. Like a little triangle. And then on the other side, it seems pretty much the same, so I'm gonna be drawing another triangle there as well. Lastly, it's just the arm over here, which there's a small triangle here, but another easier way to do this is by starting out with a rectangle, then taking out this bottom portion of it, and then just rounding out the sleeve. And if you want it to be more detailed, you can go ahead and clean that up a little bit. Add some little angles that are similar to how it is in the portrait. And there you have it. You have the general shape for George Washington. So what I'm gonna end up doing right here is I'm gonna start chopping up some of the areas or separating them into pieces where I want different patterns. And you can do this any kind of way that you would like. Just make sure that each of the places give you enough space to really work with a pattern. We don't want to have it too small of a section because you're not going to really be able to work with it in the end. And if you want, feel free to do some of the outline for the background, but for now, I'm just going to have this as the focus for the body. Now, there are a few different ways to have some patterns, and I do have a couple of references for it over here. Here are some of them that I like to use more commonly. I have one that looks more like them threading back and forth. And what I like to do with this one is start out with one line going from right to left, and then another line going left to right, and a back and forth pattern until it looks like the fabric or whatever the lines are kind of threading into each other. And then from there I like to add some other details like either stripes, some dots, or some zigzag motions. A few other ones may be a little bit more complicated on here, like the cloud shape or possibly certain types of swirling patterns. But the rest of these are fairly simple. Some other suggestions, one is similar to bricks, which would be a checkered pattern. The main difference is that all of the lines vertically are going to align together. They're not going to be a back and forth pattern like here on the bricks. But when you have those ideas for the patterns that you want, feel free to go ahead and add them onto your base for George Washington. And sometimes, like I said earlier, there's going to be some patterns that you may want to have colored, you may want to have some other interest to it, and eventually, you'll have something like this. This is an example from another class, but you'll have patterns that, at least for me, I have some that are black and white, I have some that don't really have any other additional colors to it, I have some of them that have hints of colors, and a few of them that are just fully colored in themselves. Whatever you'd like to do, as long as you keep in mind the types of patterns and the amount of space that you have, I would say go for it. Thank you. Bye-bye.